Following an eventful morning at Davos, I just wanted to get on here for a few minutes, kind of recap and live react to what US President Trump has been saying in his virtual address to the World Economic Forum. Just because I think it's kind of interesting, reflecting both the new and the old Trump. As well as it's pretty consequential, kind of given the crowd. We've seen Stephen Schwartzman of Blackstone, we've seen Brian Monahan of Bank of America, so in the crowd and in the panel. So we wanted to just kind of react to this and provide some insights. So Trump's speech is coming after a quite controversial comment from Javier Milei of Argentina. This is someone who's been obviously controversial, but also notably successful in what he's been doing with the economy in response to some heavy inflation as well as some poor economic performance. So during his speech, he said, quote, "Feminism, diversity, inclusion, equity, immigration, abortion, environmentalism, and gender ideology are, quote, various heads of the same beast," when talking about large government and kind of the expansion of the state. So someone who's quite opposed to all of this. I think that's just kind of shocking, but also not so surprising. So quite an eventful start to the morning. And then this is kind of what preceded Trump taking the virtual stand. So Trump, in pretty typical fashion, opened the speech with a quite bold assertion, but one that is quite characteristic of him, stating that we have entered the golden age of America as of Monday, January 20th, when he was inaugurated. So taking a not surprising American-centric focus of the speech, and then stating how American prosperity and freedom, etc., will be the catalyst for economic prosperity and peace that has never been seen before. A very Trumpian way to put that. So off to a very strong start for Mr. Trump, of course. From there, he went into his tariff tirade, notably soft in this regard. Of course, the speech hasn't fully completed at the time of this recording, but he's going pretty soft here, which is kind of in line with what his actions have been like. Obviously, a lot of talk, typical of Trump, but really very little action in this regard. Something that's a little bit surprising, kind of given his campaign rhetoric, but he's been very, very soft on the tariffs with his February 1st deadline for Canada and Mexico, and then him actually sending a contrasting date to his agencies of April 1st to report back to him on kind of the viability and the economic impact of tariffs. But anyways, going back to Trump's live speech, he did come back with the kind of USA-centric theme, and that's, make your products in the US or you're going to have to pay a tariff. Nothing kind of crazy here, no specifics, kind of very, nothing that's very tangible to businesses right now, for international businesses, but something keep note of that he wants you to make it in the USA. Again, kind of a very typical Trump position. And of course, as part of Mr. Trump's kind of aggressive and very American-centric start, he of course talked about the preceding administration, how terrible everything had been run, kind of trashing them, picking up right where he left off in his inaugural address. So not a very shocking thing for him to do, but kind of notable that setting the tone that things are very different from now on compared to the failed policies of the prior administration. Moving on to oil, which is, again, part of Trump's big drill, baby, drill campaign promise, something he even said during his inauguration speech. He really targeted Saudi Arabia, someone who is kind of trying to cozy up to him, MBS, of course. But he's really targeting Saudi Arabia and OPEC, talking about the cost of oil and not only how this will benefit consumers, benefit Americans, something that should have been done already, as he said, something he believes this group is kind of artificially propping up, which as a cartel it kind of is. But there's the economic facet here, but he's also saying that this is what's actually keeping Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war. Not something that a lot of geostrategists might agree with, But something that Trump is certainly claiming. So again, another notable point here, and something that could signal in his later actions to kind of bring Russia to the negotiating table, that he wants to drive the price of oil lower with drilling in the U.S., with forcing these countries to drill as a means of kind of harming the Russian war machine so that the war is untenable. Another very Trumpian kind of simple way to put things, obviously a lot more complicated in real life, but something that could kind of point to later action from the Trump administration. Next, kind of sticking with the geopolitical theme, we've seen Trump saying he's going to make NATO members pay 5% of GDP, up from the current 2% of GDP target that really was not being met during Trump's first term. Something that, as the Russia-Ukraine war kind of kicked off, something that a lot more nations did end up kind of at least getting closer to, and something that Trump makes very vocal. He brings very vocal attention to this. He says, I insisted that they pay, and they did, because the United States was paying the difference at the time. Well, I do have my opinions that the U.S. is probably subsidizing the European side of NATO's kind of failure to meet this GDP target, at least the 2% target, and using kind of that difference to then prop up their welfare states. This 5% is kind of really a big shock, something, not a big shock, but a big departure from kind of what the reality is. So that's something that we will be seeing in the coming years. Trump kind of trying to pressure these NATO countries, using the threat of the U.S. leaving, of course, as kind of a way to force this to happen. Well, NATO members kind of agree that this is a problem. Not sure how much action we'll see here. One notable thing I did forget to add, but I want to drop in here, is, of course, Trump's big inflation talk. Of course, he said that during Biden that they were the highest ever, or probably the highest ever, so kind of covering his ass there, because obviously we had the 70s, the 80s, kind of that whole thing going on, but something that he said he's going to address. Of course, this, the Fed, everyone's probably, ripping their hair out at this comment, because there's obviously a very kind of long-term oriented, very cautious ethos at the Fed right now, especially given kind of their screw up in 21, 22. So they're very much taking a cautious approach to these, to both inflation and interest rates. He said that they're both going to come down. That kind of remains to be seen, a big question of the Trump presidency from the onset here. Moving on to China, something he's been kind of notably light on. Mr. Trump doesn't kind of threaten the same tariff or a trade war that he initially saw in his first presidency. He's just talking about fairness is what he wants. What does this mean? It's kind of difficult to determine. But of course, he's going to see the trade deficit as kind of being unfair, and kind of using this deficit in trade as kind of a bargaining tool that, if China doesn't adhere to fair economic policies, then the tariffs are going to come on and the trade is going to fall. But of course, while he's kind of been light on China, he's been hard on Canada and to a lesser extent Mexico, stating that if they don't kind of come to the negotiating table and provide an even better deal than kind of the win-win they have now with the U.S., then the tariffs are going to kind of come up, and they're going to come up fast and hard. And as kind of Trump concluded his speech, he, of course, touting himself, his progress and everything, very much more so on the fun side of things, but he's talked about being president, and gloating that he's going to be president during the Olympics, during the World Cup, something that he didn't imagine during his first term, as obviously it didn't coincide with kind of that subsequent term that he lost to Biden. But now that he's back, that he, quote, got lucky enough to be in this position, gloating that, this is going to be a huge event during his presidency. So typical Trump again, but something kind of fun to point out. Now, as Trump concluded his address, again, focusing on the American exceptionalism, how great it is that the Olympics and the World Cup will be during his presidency, It then moved into the Q&A part of the address, so moving to a panel with some very, very high-profile notable figures. Of course, it's Davos, so that is to be expected. The first question, coming from Stephen Schwartzman of Blackstone, talked about regulations specifically pertaining to the EU. This is something that Trump has kind of noted in his past, but very little in terms of actual policy to address this. He specifically just talked about how unfair the EU is towards American companies, sticking with kind of prior assertions, talking about the different kind of regulatory approval processes that hold up American companies, the VAT tax, taking a jab at that. And then, of course, the big tech firms, how they've kind of been the target of a few EU regulations for, monopolistic practices or unfair practices. So something that he's, of course, going to be very vocal about in terms of actual policies, we'll see, but kind of making the case for kind of his big break from the EU, unless kind of things change and regulations come down and taxes come down. So all that good stuff that he's taking aim at. When confronted with questions about the U.S. supply of LNG to Europe, he said he will agree to commit to sending U.S. natural gas to Europe, contingent on a deal, of course. He is Mr. Trump, author of Art of the Deal. But again, another impactful but not super surprising comment from Mr. Trump. And in line with this, and talking about energy, he did tout his Project Stargate with all the OpenAI, SoftBank, all the investment in data centers. Of course, this genius idea, moving electricity facilities or electric production facilities right next to data centers. So, and then having, of course, the primary energy generation, but also backup, good, great, clean coal as backup. So, continuing to kind of tout this project and the importance of having energy for the kind of artificial intelligence revolution. Moving back to the kind of the inflation, taxes, interest rates conversation, Bank of America CEO Brian Moynihan, he asked a few questions kind of about Trump's flurry of executive orders, congratulating him on kind of the volume of policy that has come out of the first few days of the Trump presidency. And Trump talked about how that despite the kind of economic implications that these orders will actually result in lower inflation, and all of this, meanwhile, while companies do enjoy a tax rate. So, kind of keeping up with the, renewing the initial Trump tax plan, as well as potentially lowering corporate taxes, especially for those that are small businesses and those businesses that are producing in the USA as part of his return to a manufacturing economy policy. And of course, he did make use of the opportunity to kind of attack Moynihan a little bit and also noting J.P. Morgan for not banking or debanking some conservatives. So something that, again, never missing an opportunity to throw a jab there. And then to wrap up, returning to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, something that he's been very vocal that he has the power to end and to end quickly. Mr. Trump says that it's still a little up in the air, so kind of backing down from what he previously said is that Russia will back down very quickly. Mr. Trump himself has kind of retreated, saying, you have to talk to Russia, you have to see what they're going to want. Because Ukraine is ready, but he just doesn't have that power over Russia right now to kind of guarantee that the war will come to a conclusion. So with kind of that final comment, it's kind of fair to say that this was nothing out of the ordinary for Mr. Trump. Obviously, he hit on trashing the previous administration. He talked about taxes. He talked about tariffs. He talked about kind of foreign policy. And the main takeaways I would have from this address from Mr. Trump, so obviously he wasn't there in person, very busy, and he doesn't want to make this kind of his international debut. Fair enough. Very light on kind of the concrete details, so a little bit in the tax policy, which was good to see. Obviously, some targets on the EU, so it looks like he took a more aggressive tone with the EU than with China, so not really seeing the China hawk Trump that one might have expected. Continuing on kind of the foreign policy stuff, a little bit lighter on Russia Ukraine than we would have expected, but obviously touting the importance of gas prices in that war. So something we'll probably see linked together in his continued comments and policies. Um, Additionally, kind of heavier on the Mexico-Canada tariffs. Nothing crazy there, kind of given his rhetoric in the past few weeks. And then, of course, classic Mr. Trump, just praising his administration, what he's done on immigration, what he's going to do on interest rates, what he's going to do on inflation. So, again, nothing super, super out of the ordinary here, very typical, but something I figured I would react to. And, of course, he's not afraid to kind of say what's on his mind, talk about his brilliance, talk about his support for the conservative movement, targeting Bank of America CEO there, targeting JP Morgan. So kind of all in all, this is classic Mr. Trump. Not really a speech you would expect any other foreign leader to make at the World Economic Forum, but not really surprised on my end here. So with that, I'll end the video and say thank you for listening, and let's see what happens here in these coming weeks, months, and years under Mr. Trump. Certainly not going to be straightforward.